Good morning. Today is Wednesday, October 23rd, and as promised, episode 2 of NASA Days. Today we're going back to 1985 again, and STS-51J. Also new to the Kennedy Space Center, like me, was the Space Shuttle Atlantis, or OV-104 as she was called by her serial number, those who worked out there. All of the shuttles were internally referenced by serial numbers, or OV, Orbiter Vehicle, with a number afterwards. So OV-102 was Columbia, OV-99 was Challenger. It came before Columbia because the air body frame was actually a test unit that they made into Challenger. OV-103 was Discovery. OV-104 was Atlantis, and then much later, of course, OV-105 was Endeavour. But Atlantis arrived at KSC in April of 1985, about 3 months before I did, and it was in the midst of its first flow processing in July when I arrived, and it was in the Orbiter Processing Facility. It actually moved between the Orbiter Processing Facility and a holding cell in the VAB for a while, back and forth, as they processed Columbia, Challenger, and Discovery for their missions. But it moved into the Orbiter Processing Facility finally for its official first flow processing, leading up to rollout in July. One of the first flow requirements is to verify that the orbiter to engine interface is working, completely functional, with a piece of GSE, or ground support equipment, we call a 3-engine simulator. And this was a big square boxy like piece of GSE, probably about 5 feet long, 4 feet high, 2.5, 3 feet deep. And as the new guy to the job, this task fell to me, along with a new hire that was out there from Vandenberg Air Force Base training, because we were going to launch space shuttles from Vandenberg later the next year. And so we went off and tried to perform this test. Now, the main electrical interface between the space shuttle and the engines is 2 3-phase AC power connections, as well as 3 command lines and 2 data lines. So we parked. It actually came in on a forklift. We put the 3-engine simulator on the floor of the OPF bay under the back of the space shuttle, dragged 3 large cables up and into the holes in the back of the orbiter where the engines were eventually going to go, and connected them up to the electrical interface panels connecting the engine and the orbiter. So what we did is we tested to ensure that the AC voltage was in spec. It was 208 volts AC, and all 3 phases were 120 degrees phase shifted between them. Now, the orbiter doesn't generate it runs on fuel cells. So it takes hydrogen and oxygen when it's in space and converts DC voltage. On the ground, obviously, we supply the DC voltage into the 3 main buses we called Main A, Main B, and Main C. Each of the DC buses had an AC generator in there that created its own AC. We called AC1, AC2, and AC3. And so Main A generated AC1, Main B generated AC2, and Main C generated AC3. We tested also that all of the commands that the GPCs could send through their flight critical data buses were received by the 3-engine simulator, and the simulated data set that was in the 3-engine simulator could be understood and processed by the flight computers. And all of that worked out fine. Talk briefly about the engine interface unit, because that's a box that sits between the flight computers and their flight critical data buses and the engine controller. It kind of acts as a bridge between the two. Why does it exist? Well, there was 3 of them. Each engine had its own EIU 1, 2, and 3 for engine 1, 2, and 3. And the reason was that the orbiter and all of the electronics inside the orbiter were managed by the Johnson Space Center, whereas the engine controller, being mounted directly on the engine, was managed by the Marshall Space Flight Center. And the orbiter project at JSC mandated that anything that talked on the flight critical data bus had to use a very specific interface card built by Honeywell in Phoenix, Arizona. And I'm kind of busy right now. And the engine controller guys did not want to use that interface card by Honeywell in Phoenix. They preferred to use the interface card by Honeywell in Clearwater, Florida. So obviously this wasn't about not trusting Honeywell because they were both the same company. One had an office in Phoenix, one had an office in Clearwater. It was more about control. The orbiter project at the Johnson Space Center didn't want the Marshall project, and vice versa, the Marshall project didn't want the Johnson project to have any control over itself. They wanted to be independent. And so, hence, the engine interface unit box was created, all three of them, as to act as a go-between between the political rivals between the Johnson Space Center and the Marshall Space Flight Center. So anyway, all the interfaces were tested successfully, and Atlantis rolled out of the OPF to the VAB on August 12th, 1985. I was actually in the VAB. I ended up working second shift, which was 3:30 p.m. to midnight, and we were troubleshooting a power issue with one of the EIUs. And I was in the VAB with the Space Shuttle Atlantis mounted to the external tank, and the external tank is mounted to the two solid rocket boosters on each side, and the two solid rocket boosters are mounted to the mobile launch platform by 4 large bolts on each booster. So the whole integrated stack is mounted to the ground, to the mobile launcher, by essentially 8 bolts. And I was working with an electrical tech, and I was inside the Space Shuttle Atlantis's aft compartment, on a platform just inside what we call the 50-1 door, which is one of the doors leading into the aft compartment, and very high up near the forward bulkhead of the aft. And that's where the avionics bays were. Well, below me were the 3 Space Shuttle main engines, and the flight control team was performing what they called a frequency response test. And the engines were moved back and forth, and then back and forth faster, and then back and forth faster. And then they were really going back and forth, and they were shaking the whole ship, and we're bouncing around, sitting up on top of the thing, and the engines were swaying back and forth really fast. And actually, the spacecraft operator, who's up in the cockpit, called over the communications network to the test director and said, "What is going on here?" And he's like, "Oh, they're doing the frequency response test." And about that time, the frequency response test was over and the engine stopped moving. But it was kind of exciting sitting there inside the aft compartment with the engines swaying back and forth underneath and bouncing around and everything moving. I'm pretty sure later on, in later years, they weren't allowing people in the aft compartment during that test. But that was one of the memories that I still carry to my day, still being able to think and see those engines moving underneath me when I was in the aft compartment. It was really an amazing sight. But once it completed its VAB testing, it rolled to the launch pad on August 30th. And once at the launch pad, Atlantis performed a flight readiness firing, which again was one of the first flight requirements to validate the entire shuttle system works with the ground system. It's almost exactly like a launch countdown, except there's no crew on board. We load propellants into the external tanks, and we count down towards launch. As we get close at engine start, the onboard orbiter, their avionics, the GPCs, general purpose computers, running what they call a redundant set launch sequencer, piece of software that runs in the GPCs. It commands engine 3 to start at T-minus 6.6 seconds. And then it commands engine 2 120 milliseconds later, and engine 1 120 milliseconds after that. And the space shuttle engines take about 5 seconds to start and get through the start build, initial combustion and then thrust build up to 100%. It takes about 5 seconds before they enter what we call main stage. At T-minus 2 seconds, the orbiter's general purpose computers, this RSLS software, verifies that all 3 engines are above 90% thrust. And if they are, then at T0, it authorizes sending the command to ignite the boosters and blow the bolts that are holding everything to the pad, and the shuttle would launch into space. Well, for the flight readiness firing, what they do is they change the check from verifying 3 engines are at greater than 90% to making sure that the 3 engines are greater than 150%. Obviously, that can never happen. And so that check will fail. And they move the time from T-minus 2 seconds to T-plus 13 seconds. So what happens is you count down, you start the engines, and then in T-plus 13 seconds, they verify the engines are above 150%, and they're not. Surprise, surprise. And so the engines, the onboard computer shuts all the engines down. It shuts it down, engine 1, then engine 2, and then engine 3. So you start them 3, 2, 1, you shut them down 1, 2, 3. A few days after this test, I was at the launch pad on STS-39A. I was on second shift, and I was out with a friend of mine who worked engine systems named Ed, and we were checking on the status of some paperwork out at where they keep all the open problem reports and things like that out at the pad. And we decided we'd go up on the mobile launch platform. Atlantis was there, obviously, and the big metallic rotating service structure they have around the orbiter to gain access was actually rolled back into the park position, like it would be for launch. And all the xenon lights were lit up, and so the entire integrated space shuttle and the stack and everything was lit up against the night sky. And we were sitting there just staring and marveling at how beautiful this was to be out at the launch pad with this. And it started to rain. And so we climbed up under the engine nozzles to get out of the rain. And I just remember sitting there thinking, here I am, a young person I love space since an early age as a kid. And here I am standing under the engine nozzles out at the launch pad with this whole integrated stack of a vehicle and space shuttle ready to go. And I'm hiding under the engine nozzles to get out of the rain. And I'm just remember thinking how truly blessed I am to be working at really what was the best job on the planet. It was incredible. So it was really, really amazing. A little extra bonus. The following week, I was in the firing room actually doing some on-the-job training. And I was on console actually doing, running the test. I had a certified operator sitting next to me, kind of like a learner's permit in a car. And I was running the test. And because this was a DoD mission, if there was a classified operation going on, I shouldn't have been allowed in there because I was not cleared. I didn't have my security clearance yet. But there was no classified operation going on, and security let me in. And I was there running the test, and all of a sudden the head of Lockheed Security came by, just doing a wander, and kicked me out of the firing room, basically. He escorted me out, and he's like, no, you're not allowed to be in here at any time because this is a secure control room and you're not cleared. And so I got escorted out of the firing room, so that's kind of cool. Anyway, Atlantis did launch October 3rd, 1985, launching a pair of super secret supposed military communications satellites to geosynchronous orbit. I can neither confirm nor deny that, but that's what Wikipedia says, and I probably believe them, so, it did land successfully October 7th out at Dryden, or Edwards Air Force Base in California, completing its maiden voyage. And in a sense, I'd completed my maiden voyage and my maiden flow. I followed Atlantis all the way from orbiter processing through VAB through launch. And so together, this was kind of my maiden voyage too. And I was ready for my next exciting adventure, which would be, I was excited. I got the training seat, so I was going to be in launch control room for a launch. As a training person, just like I was on the job training, I got to be in there with a certified operator. And so my next launch was going to be Challenger in January 51L, and I was super excited. But that's a story for another day, and hopefully I can tell it. I'll talk to you all later. Have a great day.